I'm Marc DiPaolo. I'm an assistant professor of English at Southwestern Oklahoma State University, and I'm a member of the American Academy of Religion. We've been holding panels on class at the Southwest region in a conference called SWICRS for several years now. And when I first attended the Working Class Studies conference last year, it occurred to me that a lot of the work that was being done in the field of religion in class should be brought to here. So I wanted to invite several of my friends and colleagues who I've worked with both and through the American Academy of Religion and the two religiously affiliated institutions I've taught at, bring them here to kind of talk about the way in which the right wing kind of, certainly in America, and maybe we might talk a little bit internationally, uses theology as a way to mobilize working class people, perhaps to vote against their own best interests. And it's specific definitions of Christianity that maybe are a little more dominionist. So I invited people who I thought would be the most interested in talking about that sort of thing, either from a personal perspective or from their careers or from their knowledge of theology, or just the friends, colleagues, and family members who are in the working class who maybe buy into some of the more right-wing formations of religion. So I invited Jerry Vigna, who I knew from Alvernia University, who was my dean. He does systemic theology, right?
Systematic
theology. It's systemic. This whole theology thing is just systemic. You know? I'm so used to saying systemic. It's a systemic problem, so that's why. Okay.
So there's a lot of theology.
And Susanne Scholz is a friend of mine from the American Academy of Religion. We've worked together for many years there. And actually, because I wasn't sure we were going formal, I hid your paper. Could you talk a little bit about yourself and the work you've done?
Yes, okay. I'm a professor of Old Testament at SMU's Perkins School of Theology, where I've been for the last 9 years. I have published and edited 14 books. My specialty is biblical studies. There's such a thing. Most people in the secular world don't know anything about it. More specifically, the Hebrew Bible, and I read the Bible as a cultural artifact, cultural political artifact, and I want to plug my book, The Bible as Political Artifact, that came out last year. And I have many other books, and you can find me on my website, Susanne-Scholz.com.
And this is another one of my friends and colleagues from Alvernia University, Nathan Thomas, who works at theater. And she gave me this. So what do you want to say about yourself?
What did I want to say about myself? I'm the director of theater at Alvernia. This will be our 15th season coming up this next year. And I'm a professional actor and a director, and the son of an ordained minister, and come from a long line of ministers and teachers who, in the rural Midwest, are kind of working class people too. It's an interesting intersection of that. I think that's all I need to say right now.
That sounds good. So that's a preview of what we can expect. So I thought we'd begin with just some brief statements from everybody, and then maybe open it up to questions from the audience and conversation between us. I thought we'd start with Susanne.
Yeah. Our topic is religion, neoliberalism, and right-wing populism in the United States. And I mean, religion is such a big field. I don't even know how to approach it. So I thought I have 4 points on my list, which I might shorten or elongate a little bit. As a Bible scholar, I mean, I have a PhD in Old Testament studies, and so I like to approach things from my own field, because religion is just too amorphous. Some people say everything is religion, so I can handle this. But I have 4 points, and I wanted to begin by saying when I hear this topic, religion, neoliberalism, and right-wing populism in America, of course, the first thing that comes to mind is that not only do I live in the South now, namely in Texas, in Dallas, Texas, where the Christian right is extremely strong, but this is, of course, not only happening in the southern part of the United States. I would say maybe only Europe is an exception to the rule because we face religious fundamentalism across the world in all kinds of religious traditions, and I like to look at right-wing populism in this kind of internationalized perspective into which then I fit my thinking as a Bible scholar, because when I encounter people, whether they're religious or secular, they have absolutely no idea what a Bible scholar at a university does. And the paradigm of it's a binary paradigm prevails in anybody that I'm talking to. So I imagine that not to my systematic theologian colleague on my side here, but to everybody else, whether they're secular or religious, they think either the Bible is there to for private, personalized, individualized reading and piety on the one hand, or if that happens to anybody who was raised in the West, they read the Bible and think historical descriptions of once upon a time, and then if you're a secular person, you reject that notion. You know that nobody walks on water, so this is not true, it's false, so we reject it, or we have to believe it, which is then the fundamentalist option that you go against the scientific evidence, and that's why we have creationism and these kinds of things happening in the Christian fundamentalist context. And therefore, people don't know anything about biblical studies and what we are doing. And I spare you the details of how the academic field of biblical studies emerged, but we can say that it definitely has something to do with the involvement of the modern worldview and epistemology since the 15th, 16th century, más o menos. And the historical critical paradigm in the 19th century, of course, became dominant. And although in the United States, at least, we were struggling about this, and we called some Bible scholars, even at the end of the 19th century, still heretical because they used this kind of historical reading of the Bible. By now, even the most fundamentalist Christians, and I don't want to talk about Jews right now because I'm just focusing on the Christian right in that sense, will accept that we have to wrestle with the question whether or not the Bible is historically true, and that's the meaning of truth, and that's sort of the division that exists. And of course, as Bible scholars, we don't even really think about that as a problem anymore. It's so clear that, especially in the Hebrew Bible, I think in the New Testament it's still a little more contested because we have Jesus come into the room suddenly. What are we doing about the historical Jesus? But in terms of the Hebrew Bible, we know they're the minimalists and the maximalists. The maximalists are basically the fundamentalists who think everything started probably with Adam and Eve, and if not with Adam and Eve, then it started with Abraham and Sarah and Hagar. But in the academic field, we don't believe. We have sufficiently researched the historicity of these documents to know that at best we can maybe at best start in the 8th century BCE, but most likely in the Babylonian exile, which would be in the 6th century BCE. But what I'm trying to say in my first point, where I'm pointing out to you basically the general ignorance about biblical studies as an academic field, even within the academic field of biblical studies, we definitely have not talked about the working class or economics as it relates to working people in the contemporary centuries, or like in the last since the industrialization in the 19th century. Biblical scholarship has emerged with completely different objectives, and I was thinking about it this morning how I would want to sum it up, and in a summary I would say it has wrestled with the problem of origin, the historical quest, which has occupied the modern mind now for the last 500 years. So the point was never of biblical studies to talk about all the working classes, the plumbers, the hairdressers, the factory workers. The point was to contribute to the code civilizing project, and therefore biblical studies, and we have studied this now in the last 20 years, was also heavily involved, of course, in the colonizing project. Colonialism without biblical studies, because the ministers then went to India and God knows where they all went, African countries, have brought this kind of theologizing based in the Bible. Most of them were Protestants, although there were also Catholic ministers. So it's like a big story point, but the one that I want you to remember is that in its major drive, biblical studies was not interested in connecting to the real world problems, which is not only in terms of working class issues, has of course also gender, racial ramifications where we can find similar things that went on over the centuries. So this is my first point. I have in the past, and this is my second point, and that's I think how we met, Marc, organized a few panels and thought about the topic of class and the Bible. And in one of those panels, I researched a little bit, is there any literature in the history of publications of anybody who worked on economics and class and the Bible? And I found a very intriguing book in the 19th century, actually. 1853 is the first one that I discovered, called The Bible and the Working Classes by an author called Alexander Wallace. And I just reread it before coming here to just, because I had forgotten about it a little bit, what he's writing about. But what he's writing about, it's written in Britain, but then was also brought over as a book to the United States. It's sort of like missionary handbook lectures. He gave lectures to actual factory workers and to the working classes, 14, I think, or 15 of them, in which he outlined, from the Old Testament over to the New Testament, and then at the end, actually, in 2 lectures, handling the whole problem of disbelief in the Christian narrative and about atheism is kind of interesting. But ultimately, it's a colonizing little book, the way how I would summarize it. If you working classes, you poor people, you work so hard, if you would just get cleanliness into your homes and order and structure, then all will be working out fine for you. So clean up your houses and follow the path of the church. This kind of, but in a very wordy and generous spirit, but ultimately a very colonizing attitude. But nevertheless, this is a book that addresses the working classes. And I found 2 others in the 19th century, but then I want to quickly highlight one from 1924, which was published in my native tongue in German by a Protestant minister whose name is Hans Brubacher, Bruppacher, and it's in German, and I translated the title. It was not translated into English, The Significance of Poverty in the Old Testament, in 1924. And what I have found so kind of mesmerizing in that little book is that he actually talks about widows and orphans, and no feminist Bible scholar I know has ever looked at that little book as a major concern. He has like 2 chapters on this, which is a lot, and none of us who work in feminist biblical studies have ever known this little book. It's of course in German, so the Americans don't like to read any other languages, but even the German feminist Bible scholars don't know anything about that little book either. So they have been a few little titles here and there that occupied themselves with the working classes, with labor, with the workers, even with the widows and the children. But of course that never made it into mainstream academic biblical studies. So this is my second point, that there are a few little hints there, but they are really, 5 is a lot. It's really only 4 books. And so it's kind of depressing that if we think about religion and Bible, and the Bible is still a book that's read by millions, billions maybe, billions, yes. And sort of like where I'm coming from, there's really nothing there. There were, and that's my third point, when I did this literature review, 2 waves. And I think that's very interesting, because I think whenever we have in academia an interest in a particular topic, we are part of this wave. It's not something that we just do in isolation. arguably, this book by Wallace in 1853 was, of course, the Industrial Revolution was in high gear, right? So he probably saw a serious need to address all these factory workers slaving along and getting killed by fires and God knows, by all these illnesses, by the industrialization. We have two waves where scholars didn't talk about working classes, but they did talk about economic issues in terms of poverty. And the first one is in the 1920s. Okay, so we find actually literature emerging about economics, class and poverty, and the Bible in the 1920s. And Brubacher's, this German little book, is part of it. And a minister, of course, who also confronts people who are maybe not even coming to his congregation on Sundays, but he knows they are in his neighborhood. And the other one is in the civil rights era, 1960s to early 1980s, and there are lots of books written because that was the era of the Christian liberation theology. I don't know if any of you know anything about the Christian, but black theology came up, of course feminist theology came up, and so also liberation theology was of course concerned with class. These are two ways, so if you do a little literature search, you find out that there were, but these are not mainstream academic efforts in how we have dealt with class and poverty and issues of economics in the field of biblical studies. So it's kind of, in my view, a depressing situation where we really don't want to talk about it that much. And then, I have details, but I don't need them. Feminist Bible scholars, a few of them actually talked about the issue of economics. One, we have Roland Burr, who even wrote a book on something on Marxism and feminist study of the Bible that was published in the early 2000s. So we have literature on that. But all of these efforts that are on the margins of the academic field of biblical studies at the same time are completely unknown in the world outside, let's say what we call here in our title right-wing populism, okay, where the literalist Bible reading dominates, and I mentioned it to Marc before, in my view, the literalist, the pietistic, I call it PPS, the privatized, personalized, sentimentalized ways of reading and doing religion and reading the Bible in this case, is the flip side of what we call neoliberalism. It just fits so very well. You're on the individual level, you don't need to think collectively, and that kind of reading strategy is of course also divorced from any kind of collective analysis such as working class or economics. So I think we need to look at the Christian right as a product of neoliberalism, like any other fundamentalism, and that's, I think, why fundamentalism has such a resurgence across the globe in so many different societies and geographic, geopolitical contexts. And it goes hand in hand with the anti-intellectualism, and we call it in the United States this Trumpism. It fits very well because it privatizes, and so the effort to try to develop a different kind of studying the religious phenomenon, in my case, is the Bible is the religious phenomenon, is currently and maybe will be a very marginalized endeavor, and since the study of the Bible, the study of religion, Christianity, does not assist in the nation-building efforts anymore that we have seen in the 19th century, where therefore biblical studies and reading of the Bible became such an academic endeavor, the question that I really have now is what would be the purpose of studying the Bible? Now, I have answers about this in my own work, how to reconceptualize biblical studies beyond the historicized, historical, scientific, empiricist paradigm, and to integrate the study of the Bible not as a text study, but as part of a larger cultural, political, social, and economic practice and theoretical discourse, I think that's the way to go. But even in my own field, which is the Society of Biblical Literature, we are focused on fetish of the text and close readings to minute details that are just beyond the pale when you think about the suffering that is going on. But we are in a double bind because on the one hand we have the populist movements, the fundamentalist movements on the one hand that want nothing to do with intellectual work because there's a lot of anti-intellectualism going on, and views that they already know what it means to believe in God through the Bible. And on the other hand, we have our fellow academic colleagues who also think religion is for them and not for us, so why should we engage in this? So I think it's unfortunate because we don't do this right now, but I could imagine actually real sociological and anthropological work where we start to talk to these people in their crazy, in quotation marks, Bible readings from our perspective, but to bring it up, what do they get out of this kind of reading? We were talking before that, and that will be my final comment here. At the same time that our economies become precarious, as we have heard in the various lectures during the conference, at the same time, religion becomes more rigid, and people seek the safety that they can't find in their other life. When all the other things become flexible and ambiguous and amorphous and precarious, religion is the one place where you can abandon all of that and can have your safety and security, emotional and psychological, even though nothing changes in the outside. And the challenge would be, how do we explain this and how do we move beyond that? And I think Bible scholars would theoretically at least be in a good position to do this, but we don't do this at all. So that's all I can tell you from my field, that it looks bleak, but there could be tremendous opportunity to open up new ways of investigation and making sense of what is happening in our world right now.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Nathan, did you want to talk a little bit about something?
Not after that. that was amazing.
If you're guessing that we did not rehearse beforehand, we did not. This is real improvisation. I told you taught me last
Just
night.
accept it also. If you're the theater expert, but I know one thing from theater improvisation, that is accept the offer.
That is, I know, but that was just so amazing that I'm still gobsmacked. So, that's good. There are a couple things that, to throw in. So, I come, in trying to wrap my my bald head around this topic over the last, over the last several weeks and thinking about this, there are two or three things that I think about a lot and have popped up in both my teaching and the work that I've been doing. I grew up in a very small town in Iowa, and it's a world that does not exist anymore. On Facebook, a couple days ago, my oldest sister posted one of these things. You know you're an old fart if you can remember, and there were like 16 things, and I remembered all of them. And I'm only in my 50s, but all of those things have disappeared, including, on one of the things, having milk delivered in bottles to your home, which used to be a job that people had. And that is a job that no one has, I think, anymore, but it's part of a world that existed in my lifetime, but is completely gone. The other thing that I think about, and I think about this a lot, is that as a country, America, even as late as the 1980s, the majority of people lived in relatively small towns, relatively speaking. The Census Bureau looks at rural and urban in a different way. They split it at 2,500. So if you get 2,500 people living in the same contiguous area, that's urban for the Census Bureau. So that may not be very urban to us, or certainly to my big city friends here, from living in Dallas, coming from Philly, coming from the great New York metro area. But certainly I can feel that because the town that I grew up in was less than 1,000 people. But even at that, it's in the 20th century, a little bit earlier than the 1980s, when still the majority of people were still rural even by the 2,500 mark. And that's a very interesting thing, is that as we look at the country, as an American, looking at our country, is that we're very recently changing and losing huge chunks of a culture that people knew. And I've also been reading in the last couple of weeks these new books that have come out, Shit Show by Charlie LaDuff and Tailspin by Stephen Brill, which are basically the same book with different stories. And no offense to either Mr. LaDuff or Mr. Brill. But they're both books about how America has entered into this disassociative place that we seem to find ourselves now as a culture and as a government and as people. And it's interesting you were talking about this Alexander Wallace and preaching to the working class. If you guys pick it up, one of the very first stories that LaDuff has in his book is a preacher to the guys who are working the North Dakota oil fields in 2014, because the natural gas, the frackers, and all the people, and you may have heard that, on the news about, all the guys going up to North Dakota, because that's where jobs are, to work in the oil fields, and there are jobs, and that's sort of the plus story about it. But LaDuff reports on the downside of that is that, one, these are dislocated people, and primarily men, who are going up there. And so he talks with a guy named Bobby from Arkansas, and he's up there, and he's working with guys who have never worked on oil fields before, don't know how to manage big trucks, and certainly don't know how to do that in temperatures below zero, in which machinery works a little bit differently. And so to be a preacher to those sorts of people, and so he's talking to Bobby, the oil worker, and Bobby says, LaDuff asked Bobby, well, what is your what do you say to the preacher? And he said, well, all right, tell the preachers I'm an atheist, but you serve food. And because what Bobby realizes, what Bobby realizes is that to be a worker in America today is that you need to work roughly about 3 full-time jobs to earn your way into what we would normally call the middle class. Or as Stephen Brill points out, is that essentially we've got about 40% of our working citizens at or near the poverty level. Mm-hmm. And we read and hear about this all the time. And in Brill's book, he talks about how we look at people almost from an instrumental point of view. And this gets to something that I'm a little bit privileged because Dr. Vigna and myself, we get to chat a lot, which is a real benefit to me because I learn a lot from that. But one of the things that I have contended for quite some time is that the true American religion has nothing to do with what is in the Holy Bible, or what we call the Holy Bible, or the Torah, or anything like that. The American religion is money. And there's this wonderful quote I love from Eugene O'Neill, who is still to this day our only Nobel Prize winning playwright in America. He said this in an interview: "I'm going on the theory that the United States, instead of being the most successful country in the world, is the greatest failure. It's the greatest failure because it was given everything, more than any other country. Through moving as rapidly as it hasn't acquired any real roots. Its main idea is that everlasting game of trying to possess your own soul by the possession of something outside of it too. America is the prime example of this because it happened so quickly and with such immense resources. This is really said in the Bible much better. We are the greatest example of, for what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Matthew 16:26. We had so much and could have gone either way. I feel in that sense that America is the greatest failure in history. But we've squandered our soul by trying to possess something outside it. And will end, as that game usually does, by losing our soul and the thing outside it too. Now, I'm not saying this just to, this is the, people on YouTube looking at this, or if anyone looks at this, well, this is the typical liberal, faculty person in America beating up on America. I want to make this quite clear from my own perspective. I'm not saying this to beat up on America. I love my country. But I do think that one of the things that we have figured out, and Mr. O'Neill refers to, is that as we move forward as a culture, is that we tend as a culture and as a government to instrumentalize human beings. And as we instrumentalize humans within this religion of money, is that dehumanization, not surprisingly, works. I'm going to corral Jerry into being an actor, and I am not Alec Baldwin by any stretch of the imagination. Mr. Baldwin did this far better than I ever could. But this is the opening bit from the film version of Glengarry Glen Ross. David Mamet wrote this speech for Alec Baldwin to introduce the movie. This is not in the stage version. It exists only in the film. And Baldwin knocks it out of the ballpark. But just to give you a taste of this, because this is the American gospel, right? So I keep taking from the top here. Let me have your attention for a moment, because you're talking about what? You're talking about bitching about that sale you shot. Some son of a bitch don't want to buy land. Somebody don't want what you're selling. Some broad you're trying to screw, so forth. So let's talk about something important. Are they all here?
Oh, one.
Well, I'm going anyway. Let's talk about something important. Put that coffee down. Coffee is for closers only. You think I'm fucking with you? I am not fucking with you. I'm here from downtown. I'm here from Mitch and Murray, and I'm here on a mission of mercy. Your name's Levine?
Yeah.
You call yourself a salesman, you son of a bitch?
I don't know listen to this shit.
You certainly don't, pal, because the good news is you're fired. The bad news is you've got just 1 week to regain your job, starting with tonight. Starting with tonight's sit. Oh, have I got your attention now? Good. Because we're adding a little something to this month's sales contest. As you all know, first prize is a Cadillac Eldorado. Anybody want to see the second prize? Second prize is a set of steak knives. Third prize is you're fired. Do you get that picture? Are you laughing now? You got leads. Mitch and Murray paid good money. Get their names to sell them. You can't close the leads you're given. You can't close shit. You are shit. Hit the bricks, pal, and beat it, because you are going out.
The leads are weak.
The leads are weak. Fucking leads are weak. You're weak. I've been in this business 15 years.
What's your name?
Fuck you. That's my name. You know why, mister? Because you drove a Hyundai to get here tonight. I drove an $80,000 BMW. That's my name. And your name is You're Wanting. And you can't play in a man's game. You can't close them. Then go home and tell your wife your troubles. Because only one thing counts in this life. Get them to sign on the line which is dotted. You hear me, you fucking faggots? A, B, C. A, always. B, B, C, closing. Always. B, closing. Always be closing. A-I-D-A. Attention. Interest. Decision. Action. Attention. Do I have your attention? Interest? Are you interested? Because I know you are, because it's fuck or walk. You close or you hit the bricks. Decision. Have you made your decision for Christ? And action. A-I-D-A. Get out there. You got the prospects coming in. You think they came in to get out of the rain? A guy don't walk on the lot lest he wants to buy. They're sitting out there waiting to give you their money. Are you going to take it? Are you man enough to take it?
Incredible.
What's the problem, pal? You must?
You're such a hero. You're so rich. How come you're coming down here and waste your time with such a bunch of bums?
You see this watch? You see this watch?
Yeah.
That watch cost more than your car. I made $970,000 last year. How much you make? You see, pal, that's who I am, and you're nothing. Nice guy, I don't give a shit. Good father, fuck you. Go home and play with your kids. You want to work here? Close. You think this is abuse? You think this is abuse, you cocksucker? You can't take this. How can you take the abuse you get on a sit? You don't like it? Leave. I can go out there tonight, the materials you got, make myself $15,000 tonight in 2 hours. Can you? Can you? Go and do likewise. AIDA. Get mad, you sons of bitches. Get mad. You know what it takes to sell real estate? It takes brass balls to sell real estate. Go and do likewise, gents. The money's out there. You pick it up, it's yours. You don't, I got no sympathy for you. You want to go out on those sits tonight and close. Close, it's yours. Not, you're going to be shining my shoes. And you know what they'll be saying? A bunch of losers sitting around in a bar. Oh yeah, I used to be a salesman. It's a tough racket. These are the new leads. These are the Glengarry leads. And to you, they're gold. And you don't get them. Why? Because to give them to you is just throwing them away. They're for closers. I wish you good luck, but you don't know what to do with it if you got it. And to answer your question, pal, why am I here? I came here because Mitch and Murray asked me to. They asked me for a favor. I said, the real favor, follow my advice and fire your fucking ass, because a loser is a loser. That is a gospel reading. That is a gospel message. Care about being a father? No. Go play with your kids. Go talk to your wife. I don't care if you're married. What the message is here, and you know, despite the homophobia, the misogyny, and the other parts that are in this, is that what we have here is a gospel message, which is what makes you a person, what makes your name, is the money you make. That is America's religion. And we can see it again and again and again in play after play after play. This spring, I did Death of a Salesman. And we see it in the news. Forget about the recent, I mean, and I'm not meaning to diminish the homophobia in the embraced in the cake suit that was recently adjudicated by the Supreme Court. But what was the bigger infraction? The infraction was a salesperson making an infraction against the gospel of commerce. That we've got to make money off of things, because even an atheistic person who does not believe within a Christian or Jewish or Hindu or whatever systematic religion still believes in the American religion, is that there's money to be made. We have instrumentalized human beings, and that's our religion. And as we look at workers and people in the working class, that becomes even harder. And the last point I would make, and this is something that is I think about a lot, which is a two-point thing, two subpoints. One is that it used to be the people who hired workers lived in the same town as the workers. That does not occur anymore. We used to all live together. Mr. Maytag lived in Newton, Iowa with all the guys who worked on the line and made Maytag washers and dryers. That doesn't happen anymore. I live now in a mill town in Pennsylvania, and my house was built in 1891, and it was a pretty high manager's house, I think, at the time. And he lives whoever owned that house lived 3 blocks from the row houses where the workers lived. That connection of working class to owners of capital no longer exists really in our culture anymore, certainly not in rural America. The other thing, which is something that we have not figured out as a culture, and it has to do as a subpoint of instrumentalizing human beings, is what are we going to do with people? In 1973, there were 1,024,000 workers, textile workers in the United States. In 2016, there were a tenth of that, about 112,000. And their wages were 30% lower in inflation-adjusted dollars. Truck drivers, real wages fell by about 60% from 1980 to 2017. And soon, they will be replaced by self-driving trucks. And we can talk about, one of the things about this whole conference is borders. And you can talk about borders and the whole right and left immigration thing is its own piece. But the other part of this is automation and the continuing drive of equating efficiency with sustainability. And when you put those two together, that further dehumanizes humans. And the upshot of that is, what are you going to do with people? Because the vast amount of human beings, I think, want something to do. But it's a real question. So I end with the follow-up of the quote from Mr. O'Neill. We talk about the American dream. I want to tell the world about the American dream, but what is that dream in most cases but the dream of material things? I sometimes think the United States, for this reason, is the greatest failure the world has ever seen. We've been able to get a very good price for our souls in this country, the greatest price perhaps that has ever been paid. But you think that after all these years and all that man has been through, we'd have sense enough, all of us, to understand the whole secret of human happiness is summed up in that same sentence from the Bible, which also appears in the teachings of Buddha, Lao Tse, and even Muhammad.
Follow that, Nathan.
Well, if you think it's good, better, best, recalibrate your thinking. Wow. For both of you. I don't know that I may be briefer, I may be longer. We'll see. This election was when white people finally stood up and said, enough. My cousin, December 25th, 2016, the birthday and the feast, for me, of the Prince of Peace. And that was Christmas dinner. It's not because we're racist. This from an interviewee on MSNBC. It's because we're being marginalized. And we're the ones being oppressed for being hardworking American citizens. Willie Jennings, professor of systematic theology at Yale Divinity School, says this: whiteness is a way of interpreting the world and having the power to sustain that vision. And there you have it. My cousin saying enough, and Reverend Dr. Jennings putting a name to that. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. I should tell you how I came to this, and it was a suggestion that I made to Marc. Through Facebook, I got in touch with some of the guys from the old neighborhood and from my high school. And they're all Trump supporters, a lot of them, with the usual troll-like remarks on Facebook and so on and so forth. And it troubled me because I wanted to know how we went through the same Catholic parish schools and to the same Catholic high school in Philadelphia, row house, blue collar, Philadelphia, Father Judge High School. And they wound up over there, and I wound up over here. And I was wondering, how did they get there? And so that was the sort of thing that I started to look at. What I have here is a collection of notes. If I were doing an actual paper, these would have been the index cards. There's not a paper here that's written. But anyway, a little data from various things that I read. Arlie Hochschild, who has a book out here, in an article in the New Republic in January 2017, was talking about Brexit and talking about Trump's election. And he was talking about an Englishwoman that he had interviewed. And he said, at stake in both these elections, it seemed to him, were not just policies, but the defining symbols of each nation. And we're going in this direction of thinking about whiteness. And in fact, this Englishwoman, the reason she voted for Brexit was because the European Union had made some kind of regulation about the purchase of tea, and it had pretty much changed the way, if it went through, it would change the way the British could have high tea. So she voted Brexit. And I was reminded of that because Lisa McKenzie, who gave a paper here yesterday afternoon, was talking about her father in the Midlands, East Midlands, and he voted Brexit because the bus used to run 2 times per day to get him into town and then out, and it was cut back to 1 per day, once per day. So he voted Brexit. But I think Hochschild is onto something when he says there is a lot of symbolic assault being experienced by my cousin and by the man interviewed on MSNBC and by all the guys who went to judge when I went to judge. And so that's what I was pursuing. And as Hochschild went on, he said, as he was doing the interviewing, it seemed to him that what was at stake for a lot of Trump supporters was personal honor. Personal honor. He says in Trump they saw strong masculine leadership, and in Hillary Clinton they saw an attack on their honor, a promotion of interests of newcomers over their interests, and that's what was eating at them. You may know the name Robert P. Jones. He wrote The End of Christian America within the last 2 years. What he said in these interviews, in this material that I gathered, what he said was, and it's interesting, white evangelicals in this election aren't values voters. They're nostalgia voters. Trump's line, "Let's make America great again," in his last minute saying, "Look, folks, I'm your last chance," was really powerful for white evangelicals who see their numbers in the general population slipping. So we're talking about something different that I'll use Professor Jennings' term, whiteness. But we're talking about an attack on that. I mean, maybe as I continue this work, I might look for a different terminology, but for me right now, that captures it. And so I continued to look at things, and I found 2 sociological pieces, one by Penny Edgell, who's at Minnesota, and she wrote the journal Sociology of Religion, that she pointed this out. She said, we had in the 2016 election American Christians who did share some core religious beliefs to which we might have attributed their vote for Donald Trump, or actually the Republican Party, if you would. And, those would be abortion and religious freedom. But Penny Edgell goes on to point out, she says, well, understand that abortion's a very big issue with Hispanic Christians in America. They didn't vote for Trump. Black Christians in America didn't vote for Trump. And what she goes on to say is, it was actually white evangelicals and Catholics who supported Trump. She sums it up by saying, to put it simply, there was no, quote, evangelical vote, unquote, in the 2016 presidential election. and no, quote, Catholic, unquote, vote. There was a white evangelical vote and a white Catholic vote. So what is behind that? Why does it line up that way? Diana Mutz, in an article you may have seen because it got some play in the New York Times. It's May 2018, Academy of Natural Sciences. Paid for by our tax dollars, so it's available online. How cool is that? And you can download it. It's a very technical sociological article, which means I didn't read the whole thing. I read the introduction, I read the conclusions, because the middle was all those R's and P's and things that I don't understand. But she goes on to further fill out what I am trying to get at. And she says that the 2016 election was a result of anxiety about dominant groups' future status. You may have seen the headline in the New York Times, because that's what drew me to the article. And the headline in the New York Times said, the Trump vote in the Trump vote in 2016 was about loss of status. That was what the headline was. That's Diana Mutz's article. And that's what she's talking about. Yeah, you know him, right? Stop. And she goes on to say, in many ways, a sense of group threat is a much tougher opponent than an economic downturn, because it's a psychological mindset rather than an actual event or misfortune. So she goes on to push these ideas. You know, she says the results of her survey work, and it is as I said, it's a very technical article in quantitative survey research and statistical analysis. She goes on to say that there's an importance to group status in the formation of political preferences. The 2016 election, she concludes, was an effort by members of already dominant groups to assure their continued dominance. That's cousin. White people finally said enough. Professor Mutz explained to me, why he said that. To assure their continued dominance, and by those already in powerful and wealthy, in an already powerful and wealthy country, to assure their continued dominance and the country's continued dominance. This is not new, by the way, in Christian thinking. Here's a quote I'll read to you. A sense of racial superiority is compensation to the little man for his sense of individual inferiority, and an artful demagogue may capitalize on it. The prejudices of nationalism are equally potent, with patriotic fervor supplying a symbol of social solidarity in an individualistic existence. Now, you may think that's one of the preachers that you're seeing on television recently, and that was a statement said recently. It sounds very contemporary, doesn't it? Mm. It's almost like if I slip the Declaration of Independence under your nose and you say, oh, that's a subversive document. I'm playing the same sort of trick on you, right? That's Reinhold Niebuhr in 1937. So, and he is widely considered America's greatest Protestant theologian. And so there you have it. So this idea of the dominant group being threatened, and that cutting across the economic, this is the Working Class Studies Association. But remember, I'm part of children of immigrants and grandchildren of immigrants. You know, our parents came here as poor immigrants, we went to college, we got PhDs. The guys from Father and Judge High School, they have MBAs, they're attorneys. This is not just working class, this idea. It crosses the economic classes and the social strata. I think, I don't want to insist too hard, and quite honestly, Rhonda, because you're the American historian, not me, and I don't want to say something completely wrong, you know? But to me, the common denominator here is what Dr. Jennings said, whiteness. You know?
I think Ta-Nehisi Coates would agree with you.
And so the last things that Jennings. Oh, by the way, this was so fortunate. Talk about providence. This was so fortunate. Willie Jennings was actually a plenary speaker last week when I was at the meeting of the College Theology Society, which is an annual meeting of Roman Catholic theologians who teach in college. And so I'm summarizing his plenary speech. Lucky me. Whiteness is an aspirational goal for immigrants. Yeah. Right? My father wanted me to go to college. And then he goes one step further, and here's his point for those of us who work in Christian theology, Christian ethics. He reminds us that this idea of dominance, this idea of mastery over other human beings, that Susanne rightly located with the beginnings of colonialism and imperialism, that's also a Christian movement. And Jennings says Christianity brought whiteness to the New World. And then he called it a spiritual and theological disease, a distorted view of the Christian world. And he goes on to say, and this is his charge to theologians like me, he goes on to say, we must tell the story of being Christian. And he said, and what we give up, meaning our interpretation of the kingdom of God is not an interpretation of human beings dominating other human beings. So I close with that charge. So when I look at this issue, when I look at my family members, my in-laws, whatever, I wrestle with what they understand their values to be, and how, from their perspective as believers, I need to engage them. So that's what I have to say. And I have about 4 or 5 more pages of notes, so if you ask me questions, I will have answers. By the way, Rhonda, interestingly, Pastor Jennings, at the end of his speech last week, talked about how difficult it is for us to imagine a new world filled with joy. And I remember you spoke about joy last night and living with joy. And when you said that, that's what he said last week. Now that I've heard it twice, maybe I'll remember.
I'm feeling bad. I played hooky yesterday. I visited my family. But I'm Italian too, and I was thinking our Malcolm X said that immigrants right off the boat get in line ahead of us and everything. And
well, yeah.
And then the other thing is the idea that maybe there's a brief shining moment where Black and Italian activists were kind of allies, and we started getting these nice suburban homes. Mm-hmm. And I guess the idea is that we've earned the whiteness. You know, we put in our time and we've got it. And so I'll say, hey, remember when we all used to be allies with Black people? Why don't we revisit that? Like, oh, well, we worked hard. We jumped classes, and then they've been here longer. They should be further along than us. Like, I think it's more complicated than that, you know. And the other thing is the total disregard for newer immigrants. Like, well, they didn't take as good a care of our old neighborhood. We moved out, they moved in, and they wrecked the joint. And that's all they'll ever kind of say. I'm like, guys, can you have any sympathy? And what's funny to me is they'll use the correct facts and reach the wrong conclusion with them. Like they'll say something like, well, you know, I mean, Italians, there have been cases where they were lynched. So I was like, not as many, and therefore solidarity, right? And they're like, no, I mean, we got over it. I was like, oh, dude. Dude, I was like, you were so close. Like, how did you veer like that? You know, and I feel like I read one of Bill O'Reilly's books. It seems like a common tactic. Like, they'll say something like, Bill O'Reilly says, and it's been one of his early books, Jesse Jackson's wrong. The main problem in America is not race, it's class. It's working class is the real problem. You know, and he'll identify all the ways in which class is a problem. And then he'll be like, which is why the answer is Reagan. And I'm like, whoa. Like, you were doing, I mean, I didn't like what you said about Jesse, but you were doing pretty good other than that. And then how did you get to Reagan? It's like, he embodies the best of class. It's like, what? You know, and I feel like Trump's like, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem. Like, yes. And the answer is
fewer oil magnates running everything. And he's like, no, the real problem is immigrants. It's like, no. So it sounds right because he's got all the right symptoms, right? But then he just picks the wrong bad guy. And I'm wondering if that's something that my relatives do, because they like, that symptom sounds right. Like the buses, that was probably the Tory government that did that.
Right. But Lisa's father
Well, what are you
voted
gonna do?
Brexit because
and
now he doesn't have
more
a bus.
Tories plus Brexit, you know, so then you get less environmental regulations.
But doesn't it also fit with the kind of general anti-intellectualism in a sense that you also don't want to, or maybe don't know, I don't know, we're not educated to do sort of like a rational analysis. And in this culture, this is very, very deep, this anti-intellectualism. You can even find it in the academic classes. So therefore, you see this symptom and boom, you go sort of like off course a little bit.
The easy fix.
Well, it's not even an easy fix. You go with your emotional Brexit, or you go to the Pentecostals because finally you can just be free in your body. You don't have the uniform or whatever. But you know, everybody is waving their arms, and you like that. And so, I mean, there is tremendous attraction worldwide to this kind of you know, fundamentalist religious expression.
No, this sounds a good time as any time to talk.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's what the folks that they're talking about are doing. And my question was, I mean, I follow all this, your arguments about whiteness and so on, but how does that then get us back to whatever religious thought or practice is enabling this, or that's a little bit of a puzzle to me.
Oh, sure.
Because I think
Let me give
I
it a try.
hear you saying, well, we should, the religious piece of this should be different, but how does it figure into their sort of evolving worldview as they come upon this conclusion that, you know, finally this vote is going to do it for me?
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
that's
holidays are a
where
big part.
I mean, I see the evangelical piece, but particularly for the Catholic, you know, Philadelphia Catholic, those guys.
But isn't it what Nathan said about the American religion is really about being materially successful,
Yeah.
and that quote unquote trumps everything?
But do these guys go to mass? And I mean, how they? That's not like that's
Well,
not where the gospel
what you're asking me, which
money is preached.
how does their understanding of Christianity support their white supremacist?
Or is it totally divorced? I mean, is
Oh,
there a connection?
no. It's
Yeah.
intertwined. Penny Edgell talks about this. You know, she talks about it as intersections, and she's actually proposing a research agenda for sociology, where she says we have to ask how all of these questions, class, religion, and so on and so forth, how they affect each other as variables that affect each other. And the idea that occurred to me when I was thinking about this is, you know, especially our being academics, where what we do is analysis, which is based on the Greek word to dissolve, you know. So everything, we unwind everything into a separate thread. But it's not like you've got the blue of this very conservative politics and the red of this very conservative, that Susanne outlined beautifully, the very conservative Christian theology. It's more like you pour the red and the blue together into the same beaker, and you've got purple. You know, you have a third thing. In terms of more specifics, it's both Protestant and Catholic ideas of personal responsibility, and as Susanne said, privatized religion and whatever. And so it forms a scaffolding where one can say, my life is in order. I have a job, I have a wife, I don't cheat on my wife. You know, I show up for my kids' Little League. So I'm doing all that right. And those who are not doing that are somehow deviant. You know, they're not. So they kind of go hand in glove like that.
I spoke a couple of years ago to my Mormon relatives who exist in a totally Caucasian Mormon world, and when they heard their daughter was going to marry a Catholic guy, they said, "Are the Catholics the one who celebrate Hanukkah?" You know, so that's sort of their multiculturalism. You know, that's what I was dealing with. And they asked me, you know, why did I like Obama so much? You know, and I said, well, for one thing, some Democrats appear to be in favor of clean drinking water. And they're like, what are you talking about? I was like, Republicans love to vote for poisoning drinking water. Like, we've never heard that. What do you, and it was just, there was no, you know, they had none of that. I said, well, why do you like the Republicans so much? Like, because they allow us to celebrate Christmas, you know. And it's like this holiday thing seems to be clear. And I hear it from Italians when replacing Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day. They get really mad about that because they see Columbus Day as a sign that they'd arrived in America. Like, we got our day. And you're trying to take our day away from us and give it to the Indians, you know? And I was like, well, you know, maybe we can pick a different, maybe we could do like a Mother Cabrini Day or a Frank Capra Day or, you know, something. Can we pick a different Italian? Because he's problematic, you know? But the idea that you can't celebrate anything anymore, right? Like, you know, Christmas it's too Jesus-y, or Thanksgiving, well, it's like, again with the Native Americans, and sort of everything's a problem, and we've got to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and we can't like Jefferson because he had slaves. And I think they feel like young people are just killjoys. They just want to destroy, which is funny because, like, that's the image they have of Democrats, is that Democrats destroy and they're elitist. But most Democrats I know are broke and quite nice, and, you know, whereas the Republicans are destroying, like, oh, education, retirement, the environment, you know, and they're quite elitist with their bank accounts. So like I try to tell them, no, you've got it wrong. I mean, fine, Democrats are marginally too conservative. And then I say that, and they go, what do you mean too conservative? You know, so we don't have the same vocabulary, but some of it does seem to be religious in a strange way. Like, I was wondering, why are they so focused on the Starbucks cup? But in a way, that is it. It's the Starbucks. I want Christmas on my Starbucks cup. Like, that's the symbolic religious importance of that. Well, it seems to be against everything. Like, and I think that might be it.
And I was there just very quickly, and I think another piece of this, from my perspective, to go, I think, is that there is a real dovetailing in our culture, between traditional Christianity, you know, what we would call, which is diminishing each year in terms of people who go to mainline religious churches, you know, like Lutherans and Methodists and so forth, but dovetails very strongly with the prosperity gospel that you'll see in a lot of television evangelists. And, you know, a lot was made the last couple of weeks of this minister down in Louisiana, you know, who asking people to give him money.
Jesse Duplantis.
To give him money for a plane because he couldn't be in a metal tube with, you know, those other people. And
54 million.
But you've got to think that there are a lot of people who are giving this man a lot of money. There are a lot of people giving this man a lot of money.
But in a way, I think this magical belief in you give money and you get money is already in that Wallace little book from 1853, right, which says, you know, you clean your house and then everything, you know, the whole thing will fall into order. So it's the focus on the individual and the cutting off of the analysis of the collective conditions, social occasions under which we function as a society, and that is definitely, I appreciate very much your comments, both of your comments, because it emphasized the violence, and of course this is a society that has enslaved people. The violence to cut yourself off of that kind of treating each other, I think it's deeply ingrained. We do it right now, I mean, with the immigrant children, and the churches should be outraged, the Lutherans and Methodists, but we are not outraged in our, neither in our theological theorizing, not in our biblical exegesis. We don't even expect it anymore. We don't expect outrage, but we don't hear it from the other religious traditions either, by the way. I mean, the Buddhists in America are silent on the topic, as are, you know, many other groups. The Mormons came up several times. I don't want to mention them all the time, but other religious traditions are silent on the topic too. So everybody gets kind of inculcated into this violence violence that's perpetuated not only worldwide by all the drones and bombs that are falling, but that have been sort of, we say, foundational, with the first genocide and then the enslavement, and now the immigrants taking away the children. It's just like the pinnacle that came up most recently, and we are silent on this.
Can I mention what I want to try to do with the field?
Yes.
In terms of, were you going to say something?
I just want to put one more thing on the table.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, shut up. This is, I think, you talk about the collect. I think that's a great point about the collective versus the individual. This sort of how easy it seems to be to read the Bible as a sort of this individual imperative rather than something that's collective. But I think for me, neoliberalism is about the state. And I think that sort of loss of collective is also the loss of the sense that the state has a role in anyone's life whatsoever. So I've been doing a study around Atlanta. I'm a historian. I study environmental politics, among other things, but I'm very interested in the birth of this sort of anti-environmental, religiously evangelical conservatism around Atlanta, which is one of the places where it really took off in the 80s and 70s and 80s. And one of the things, so I interviewed people about this, and including a pastor and people in his congregation. And what I found was that a lot of them had grown up in small towns. This is a small town thing where, and especially in the South, maybe this is true, but I guess also in the Midwest, where there was not really a government presence. It was the church that was your community. Mm-hmm. And you really didn't see anything about it. I mean, they took care of all the social services, and that was where the families kind of hung out. And so so this guy who grew up that way becomes a preacher. He becomes this sort of pushes for getting evolution out of school books and all this kind of thing. But he's really quite a success, and it's one of these mega churches that emerges around the edge of Atlanta in the 70s and 80s. And so I think that also, that legacy and that memory, that's part of the nostalgia of a lot of, I mean, he converts a lot of people who are coming in from cities and from the north and so on. And this is a huge burgeoning congregation. All of them, this is in Cobb County, out from Atlanta, which is a kind of bastion of Klan and so forth from way back. But I mean, the state is what I'm trying to say, that sort of avoidance of the state and the sort of just imagining out the state from a proper sort of moral universe as a sort of a force for the collective, I think is a part of how the religion, the transformation of religion becomes so complicit with neoliberalism.
Can I just add something, because I think this is the way I look at the world right now, it seems to me a very US-American construction, where the way how we deal in this society with racism against African Americans, but the same against brown immigrants and so on, is to privatize everything so that we defund the public sphere, and the churches or religious organizations, to use I can't say church and religious organizations, then we would need to look more specifically if that is true also for the other religious traditions. But historically, the churches have played the role in this country very different to churches in other countries, one of which I come from, so that's why I observe this very clearly. Here they have the social function in the everyday life because there is no other collective space, because the other collective spaces are businesses or malls.
So that's the other one.
Yeah. So in that sense,
so
it's
Starbucks with the cups and stuff.
That's right. But therefore also we don't, it's also, I forgot, did you talk about it or you about the segregated neighborhoods? I think it was in, the gated communities where we don't even live together anymore. Now, this has also a long history, I think, in this country. When we had slavery, across the train tracks, we know this in everyday vocabulary. And I think that's now, it doesn't mean that there is not segregation of the classes, let's say, in my native land, Germany. But it's because everything is so much closer and so on. Actually, I think at least I can talk about the Western European context, I think the battles, the social, political battles, are still carried out in the public realm, whereas here we have privatized education, therefore the public schools are inherently defunded now, and everybody who wants goes to Catholic school or some other private, and to escape that kind of immersion into the collective where then all these people from all over the world and we don't want to be with them are. So, and the church has played willingly into this role. And then, I mean, my point about my field here is, we definitely, historically, that field totally played into this role by completely not looking at any of this, which I think is probably not only for my field, which I love at the same time that I criticize it, but I think we can find it in all our academic disciplines, that kind of distancing move. And the epistemology, that's the modern one, universalizing, objectifying, and value-neutral epistemology plays into that kind of habit to distance yourself from the social locations and the suffering and pain of the people. I mean, it sort of fits like a glove, and it is definitely vibrant in my field, and I think in many other fields as well.
I grew up during one of the big rightward moves in the 80s, you know, and so the narrative of the 60s was they smoke weed, hippies, and now we've got crack-infested cities, you know, or they cared about like civil rights, and what did we get? Charles Manson butchered that poor girl, you know, so we need, you know, tough on crime, just say no to drugs, you know. And it was weird because I was just young enough that I got a taste of 70s liberalism, Wonder Woman and the Muppets, you know, and then suddenly, no, Transformers and the A-Team, and, you know, even Mr. T's Republican, you know, so that's racial solidarity. We fight the Cuban drug lords together with missile launchers, you know. So that was, I felt, the texts, all the texts, everything on TV, all the narratives promoted Reaganism.
Yeah.
And then when it was time for me to go to college, a priest said, you've got to go to a Catholic college, you've got to go to a specific kind of Catholic college, you've got to go to Christendom, because it's an Opus Dei kind of Catholic college. You don't want to go to any of the Jesuit schools, you know. And so, you know, and he says, and I have a feeling that you might be against this, so I want to give you the C.S. Lewis book called That Hideous Strength, which is about how colleges are run by Satan. And if you go to college, you get a normal secular college education, you'll become a Satanist. And, you know, I mean, I grew up with these vampire movies where Dracula turns all the hippies into vampires, Christopher Lee, or, you know, The Omen, The Exorcist. So I was like, the devil is real, and the devil's hiding behind hippies, right, you know? And so I was on the verge of being sort of really, the Beatles were cooler when they had short hair, then they got long hair, you know? They went from Holding Your Hand to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, you know? So that was the whole thing, right? So I was really on the verge of being lost, but they were giving me the safe canon of literature. Jane Austen's safe, Masterpiece Theater is nice and Caucasian. You know, superheroes are cool, they fight, you know, Russians, you know. And what was funny was, when I actually read all this stuff, because I really did not want to be possessed by Satan, you know. So, and I was a reader, so I was like, let me read this stuff. And what's funny was, when I actually read the Bible, I was like, I disagree with Jesus on everything. Why? Well, because I was Republican. I was like, every time anybody said anything Republican to Jesus, Jesus was like, fuck you. And I'm like, I'm the bad guy, the Bible, you know. And then when I was assigned to read Marcus Borg, Marcus Borg's like, well, the thing about Jesus is he's a hippie. I was like, that's what I thought. And I was like, well, if I'm a real Catholic, then I have to change my mind on every political issue, or I'm not Christian. Like, that was the moment of mine. And I was like, because I actually read the freaking book. You know, and I heard what Jesus said, and it was this weird moment for me. And I was like, and I actually decided I'm going to flip on as many issues as I could stomach to get closer to Jesus, you know. And it was this weird kind of moment. And then I realized, like, so many conservative texts, like, and then I actually read C.S. Lewis. You know what C.S. Lewis says about British public schools, like Harry Potter? He says they're horrible because all they train people to do is be colonialists, capitalists, and bullies. The only good thing about the British public school system is the gay sex. C.S. Lewis.
He said that?
Yes. He also said you have no right to say anything about the World War I soldiers in the trenches gambling, whoring, or having gay sex because you try being in the trenches.
And he was in the trenches.
And he says, I have nothing whatsoever to say about birth control because I'm not a woman. You know, and and he's defining the central tenets of Christianity. So I'm reading all this stuff, and I was like, this is the safe conservative text, So my whole enterprise as a scholar is to say, well, all these books that Pat Buchanan says are great, like, if you actually read them, like, no, like, I talk to people who, like, grew up with the Sex Pistols, and they're like, that's not radical. And I was like, yeah, I know, but it's radical compared to how they're billed. And I realized that I was actually rescued from this mindset by the original religious texts. So what I do with my research is I say, these superhero things, which, when shown in a certain light, can really promote fascism, were actually written by Jews fighting fascism. Jesus is actually pretty anti-establishment before he was co-opted in a way that was sort of, in an American way. I think of There Will Be Blood, the oil companies allegorically taking over Christianity, and I don't know if that's remotely historically accurate, but anyway, it seems true to me as an Oklahoman. Oh yeah, so anyway, I try to explode that, and I go after dominionist Christianity. In I've got an eco book coming out called Fire and Snow, and I use C.S. Lewis and Tolkien's trees and the fantasy and the Catholicism of, like, the Hunger Games to explode dominionist Christianity. So that's what I try to do. But I'm talking about all these books that my colleagues are scared. They're like, why do you want to teach the English? I kind of do that because they're worried that I'm one of them, and I don't blame them. So you say something.
It's a pity that we're so few of us to hear this and then to participate in the discussion.
Earth, don't forget that.
Sorry?
Salt of the earth.
Yeah, that's true. But I was very interested in this roundtable discussion because I'm really interested in the connection between religion and politics. I'm Portuguese and I'm a Catholic, but I would say that some of the things that we're talking about here, they have to do with the kind of ideological struggles that you see in the society that's divided. So in a way, it's nothing new. Of course, the European context is different, and the context is different in every country. If you look at Portugal, for example, the kind of history that we have in terms of colonizing Africa or ex-colonies, the persistent racism that we still have in our society, for example, and at the same time, you can look at Christians and where Christians are. Christians are in the unions, in the peace movement, the civil rights movement, but at the same time, they're in other places too. And as I said, I don't think that's anything new. If you look at slavery, for example, slave owners were Christians, and slaves were Christians as well. They just had or most of them were, but they just had a different interpretation, different view, different Christianity had a different effect on their lives. And that's what you see in liberation theology, for example, or an important theologian that died recently, James Cone from Union Theological Seminary. If you argue for theology from the point of view of the oppressed, and I think that's very easy to do if you read the New Testament, I believe that.
Mm-hmm.
But
Old Testament, let's not forget it.
and Old Testament as well, yes.
Anti-Judaism.
Stronger.
Yeah, that's true. We forget that.
The prophets.
But if you look at it that way, of course you're able to explain why Christians would be at anti-racist organizations, and why do they think that human brotherhood or sisterhood is very important? Why do they think that Christianity is not just an individual thing? It's something that has, from the outset, social dimension. If you will. It has to do with our relationship with each other. But what I would like to say is just that I think most of the times we're talking about contested territory in terms of interpretation. So I think besides being a Catholic, I'm a Dominican. I'm a lay Dominican. So one of my big influences is a Dominican friar called Timothy Radcliffe. Have you heard of him? Timothy Radcliffe. He was master of the Order of Preachers. So, and he wrote a book about why do we go to church. That was the question. And his answer is quite simple: is we go to church to be sent from church to the world. And that's a big difference. I mean, if you think that you go to church to be told something that has only impact on you, that's quite different from thinking that you're receiving something and you're being transformed in some way, and you have to go outside the church and transform the world.
And that's really the point. Do you go to church to make yourself holy? And this is a basic point of disagreement between we four and four Christians who might be in the back of the room on the other side, if you were, do you go to church to make yourself holy, or do you go to church to use the Hebrew expression, tikkun olam, to repair the world? And we're arguing the latter. We're out of time, but can I just say one quick thing? Are we going to 5:30 or 5:15?
5:15.
Yeah, I guess we're over.
Yeah. Again, going back to Penny Angel's sociological study, she said Trump appealed to real economic loss that Nathan really did a good job of describing. There has been real loss in the experience of Trump voters. There's been real economic loss. And if you work in Reading, Pennsylvania, as we do, I've been there 26 years. Even in that period, you've seen it. So real economic loss. Then, my words, hatred of the other, blacks and immigrants. That was her second point. And she said the third thing motivating Trump voters, including Trump women voters, is the return to traditional women's roles. And I didn't want to let that go by.
Yeah.
Because I heard again at the College Society meeting last week, I heard a wonderful paper by a graduate student at Boston University named Megan House, who talked about how the Southern Baptists are really pushing this idea. And I just wanted to bring it to your attention. They call it complementarianism. Mm-hmm. I'm used with to the Catholic word complementarity. God made man, God made woman, put it together, what a perfect pair. They extend the word to complementarianism, but they're very serious that the created order is a hierarchy of the Father God, the man of the house, and the wife. That means no diminishment in terms of the love God feels for her, but she, in the created order, she's got a specific subordinate role, and they're very serious about that. And no sooner did I come home from the Conciliology Society meeting than I looked at the New York Times, Sunday Times, and I forget who it was. It wasn't Molly Worthen. Another woman on the front page of the New York Times was talking about these very conservative, white, Christian, evangelical women calling themselves trads, traditional, calling themselves trad. Article in the New York Times. So,
but these are the Christian. This is the Christian right.
Yeah, but I just wanted to alert you to that. I mean, this is apparently a thing.
That was a fighting ERA was what got this pastor into politics. Right in the early 70s, fighting ERA.
Yeah. So I didn't want to.
Equal rights.
Well, and I'm in the thick of it in Oklahoma, but I guess the one thing I'm trying to do where I am is I'm a man and an English professor teaching Intro to Humanities and the history of religion and the art, like, you know, the Renaissance, things like that. But my goal is to introduce as many feminists and socialists and sort of civil rights concepts into the teaching of the history of art and literature, all the while banging the drum of I'm religious too. So they can't peg me. Like, I'm a guy feminist who's a professor who's religious and who believes in science. And they don't know how to handle it. They think it's an atheist scientist, you know, or you know, a liberal, or a religious conservative anti-science. Like, and I'm like, I don't fit cleanly into either of those. And I've been doing some damage. I mean, I've been getting some. I've been opening. If I have 50, 60 students a semester, I get a couple of them. I crowbar things open a little bit. You know, I do some damage, and my dad and my parents.
College teaching is doing damage.
Well, you know what
There's
I mean.
a takeaway from today.
Yeah, they're gonna love this on the interweb.
Well, but just in terms of getting people to love more. I mean, but my childhood priest would see it as doing damage and working for Satan, but I don't see building bridges as working for Satan. Frankly, you know, that's the way I read the Bible. I'm doing Jesus' work and being a college professor, and I don't see those as being incompatible. And I'm joking and sounding smug because I've internalized years of listening to Rush Limbaugh. But back when I agreed with him. But you know, the other thing is, my parents for years, I kept saying that the Nazis are coming, and they're like, why are you saying this? Is it because I lived in some pretty scary parts of America? And I would say things like drinking water is a problem. They want to fire all the public school teachers. And my parents kept saying, where do you get this crap? And what's interesting is in the last 2 years, my mom is a suburban swing Catholic voter. Whoever she votes for wins the presidency. The last 2 years, she's like, you've been right about everything for the last 10 years, and I didn't believe any of it. It took her about a month of Trump. And she's like, wow, I'm worried about drinking water, I'm worried about public school teachers. I was like, dude, if only you'd known this like 4 months ago.
And the Nazis are coming.
and she's like, maybe she's seen the swastika, and she's like, here, I thought you were kidding about the Nazis. And it's like, the good news is you're not crazy. And I was like, I kind of wish I was, man. Like, I wish it was just me being batty, you know. So like, I just think of if my mom, I use her as the barometer, you know, and she's seeing stuff she never saw before. And I'm doing what I can, and you know, I dedicated this book to Dad, and it's about, you know, working class superheroes, and I got him to read it as a chapter on Luke Cage, and my dad's, you know, he's got his issues with race, and he's like, I want to see the Luke Cage TV show on Netflix, so I'm watching Luke Cage with my dad, and we'll listen to the rap music, so I'm doing some damage. You know, I think we just all have to respond to this nightmare according to our gifts and our, you know, our what do you call the personality types, and just, we can't solve it all, but where we can, be human beings.
Amen.
Internet, human. I was kidding about the damage, but you know what I mean. Anyway, so I want to be. I didn't want.
Thank you for staying past time.
Thank you very much. Yeah.